And the Bible's not trying to give us a scientific explanation for creation. It's basically just giving us, a perspective of revelation that God has given to human beings with regard to the creation of the universe and creation of humanity. And there were no scientific terms that are used. And so when you look at the Bible, you should not look at it scientifically. You should look at it as, the revelation that God has provided to humans. And that in some cases, it could be that some of the information that we are given is symbolic rather than should be taken literally. And so with that in mind, let's go ahead then and look at the patriarchs. Now, the word patriarch, pater, is the Greek word father, and arch means ruler. And so patriarchs are father rulers, right? And this was during a time of clans in history, in human history. They had clans, and usually the father was the ruler of the clan. And the more kids you had, and the more livestock you had, the more wealth you had, and that was kind of the way things were. So understanding Old Testament historical narratives, first of all, we need to understand that the Old Testament is not mythology, that there is a reality that is being recorded and being presented to us, that the Old Testament history is prophetic history. It's prophetic history. It is not only giving us history, but it's also forecasting what's coming. Okay? It's forecasting what is coming. And also, Old Testament history is selective. Okay? It's not meant to be a blow by blow of everything that happened historically. Because we can turn the page in the Bible and 500 years pass. Okay? And so the Bible doesn't give us a lot of details when it comes to the history. It's selective. It gives us the key points. It gives us the points that help us to understand what is necessary in order to lead us to ultimately Jesus. Right? Paul says that the Old Testament is, and he uses the Greek word pedagogos, which means the child teacher, okay? And so the Old Testament is like teaching us the elementary things to help us to understand why Jesus was necessary, and when Jesus came, that we recognize him as such, right? You see, if Jesus would have come in the garden, it wouldn't have made sense, okay? And so God reveals himself to humans in history. Okay? And it's through this history that we have the advantage of looking back, okay? And how many of you know hindsight's 20/20, right? When you're in the middle of it, it's hard to see. But from our vantage point, we can look back and we can say, well, okay, I can see how this all fits together. And understanding that helps us also to understand how it might have been easy for the Jews to miss Jesus. Okay? And we also need to be careful because we can miss Jesus. The writer of Hebrews says that he will appear a second time to those who are what? Looking for him. To those who are looking for him. Okay? And so we need to have understanding that Old Testament history is selective history. Now, when Abraham was called in Genesis chapter 12, and if you have your Bibles, you can turn there. Genesis chapter 12, verse 1, the Lord said to Abram, and his name was Abram at the time, leave your country, your people, and your father's house, and go to the land I will show you. I will make you into a great nation, and I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. And I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you I will curse, and all the peoples of the earth will be blessed through you. So Abraham left, as the Lord had told him, and Lot went with him. Now, it'd be nice if the Lord would really spell it all out and tell us exactly what he wants us to do, wouldn't it? But God doesn't work that way. It'd be a whole lot nicer and easier if he did, but this is the way he does it. And how many of you know his ways are best, right? And so all it says in the Bible is that God said to him, leave your country. He didn't tell him where to go. He just said, leave. And so Abraham had to take steps of faith, right? Faith has always been that which God requires. And so Abraham left. Now, this is a map of how Abraham left. And so way down on the bottom right-hand side, it begins at Ur of the Chaldees. That's where he was at, which is like in modern-day Iran. And if I was able to, you could back off of this and look, and this bottom half down here, this is like Saudi Arabia, okay? And this is Israel over here, and then this is Damascus, so you got Syria, modern-day Syria here, okay? And all this is Saudi Arabia, which is what? Desert, okay? So notice how he went up and around, okay? This is called the fertile crescent, okay? This area here. It's because it wasn't the desert. It was fertile. There was water there, okay? You could actually travel and live, right? So whenever it'd be shorter to go across, but you would die in the desert. So this was the way that the nomadic tribes traveled. It's the way the caravans traveled, okay? People moved around during that time. And so this is the way he went down toward what we call today Israel. The Abrahamic covenant is found in Genesis chapter 12 through 21. And the provisions of the covenant, verses 1 through 5, tell us that Abraham is going to become a great nation. Now, Abram means father, okay? And God tells him you're going to be a great nation, and he doesn't even have any children. You're going to be a great nation. Great! Like when, God? And so Abraham would become a great nation, and it emphasized by the fact that Abram and Sarah were old and childless shows that it had to be something that God did, right? It had to be something that God's hand was involved in, right? And then the second part was the promise of land that God would give Abram and his descendants. Now, Abram ended up over in that land, but that land did not actually become theirs until 400 years later. Okay, so Abraham died not having received the promise. And that's what the book of Hebrews tells us in chapter 11. These people died not having received the promise, but they saw them from afar. They saw them by faith, okay? And that's the way that we still live today. We live by faith, and we are trusting God and believing him. And our thing is, Abraham's life becomes a picture of the Christian's life, because Abraham was a foreigner. He was a stranger in the land, right? He was looking for a land that wasn't his own. He was looking for a house whose builder and maker was God, right? Now, where does that leave us? We're looking to heaven, right? We're looking for a place where God builds. And so these are the provisions of the covenant, an heir and land. Now, a covenant is a contract. A covenant is a contract. If you go to the bank and you borrow money, you are making a contract with them, and you are signing that you will repay the money that they are loaning you. You sign this contract, and so you make a covenant with them. When you marry your spouse, you're making a covenant with them. All right. When you take out a life insurance policy, you're making a covenant with them. And whenever a covenant is made, there has to be consideration given. All right? Now, in the insurance industry, that consideration is money. There has to be money. I have to give them money before that covenant, that contract is made. But once my consideration is given, then the contract is valid, right? Well, in Abraham's case, he made a covenant with Abraham. God made a covenant with Abraham. Okay? And the way that he did that was that he cut a covenant. That's what it's called, cutting a covenant. And it's found in Genesis chapter 15. Genesis chapter 15, verses 7 through 13. Now let me back up. Verse 6. Abraham believed the Lord, and he credited it to him as righteousness. And he said to him, I am the Lord who brought you out of Ur of the Chaldeans to give you this land to take possession of it. But Abraham said, O sovereign Lord, how can I know that I will gain possession of it? So the Lord said to him, bring me a heifer, a goat, and a ram, each 3 years old, along with a dove and a young pigeon. And Abraham brought all these to him, cut them in two, and arranged the halves opposite each other. The birds, however, he did not cut in half. And then the birds of prey came down on the carcasses, but Abram drove them away. And as the sun was setting, Abram fell into a deep sleep, and a thick and dreadful darkness came over him. Then the Lord said to him, know for certain that your descendants will be strangers in a country not their own, and they will be enslaved and mistreated 400 years. But I will punish the nation they serve as slaves, and afterward they will come out with great possessions. You, however, will go to your fathers in peace and be buried at a good old age. And in the 4th generation your descendants will come back here, for the sin of the Amorites has not yet reached full measure. And so when the sun had set and darkness had fallen, the smoking fire pot with the blazing torch appeared and passed between the pieces. And on that day the Lord made a covenant with Abram and said, to your descendants I give this land from the river of Egypt to the great river, the Euphrates, the land of the Kenites and all the ites and Jebusites and all that. So God cut a covenant with Abraham. All right? That was the consideration that was made. All right? Everybody with me? Okay. So this is the Abrahamic covenant. Now, the patriarchal culture, again, we didn't have countries back then, okay? You just had tribes of people. And the father was the leader, the patriarch. Okay, he was the head of the home and head of the people. And they were nomadic people. And they are still nomadic people today. Okay, when I went to Jordan in 2006, we were driving through the capital, Amman, Jordan, and people were just on the sides of the road. You know, we were driving down modern highways in cars, and there were people just camping out on the side of the road. And I said, what are these people doing? And they said, this is just the way they live. You know, they have homes in the city, but they like to come out and just camp along the side of the road. And then you go out away from the city, and they're living in tents out in the middle of the desert. And that's the way they've lived for thousands and thousands of years. They're nomadic. Craig Womack told me that the government went in and they built everybody really, really nice houses, like in Saudi Arabia, where there was a lot of money from all the oil. Built really nice houses. And then they went out to see how the people were faring in their new houses, and the people had their animals living in the houses, and they were living in tents outside the houses. Okay. They're like that, yeah. They're nomads. That's their lifestyle. They wander around. And they do to this day. Okay? The word Hebrew appears in Genesis chapter 14, verse 13. I believe that's the first time it appears in the Bible where they're called Hebrews. Okay? The patriarchal structure, it was a family structure. The patriarch was the head of the clan. They believed in monogamy. However, they allowed for concubines. Okay? And polygamy was also common. Marriages were arranged. Okay? There was no such thing as dating. It was arrangements. Marriages were arranged. Women were oftentimes used in deals to make peace with other tribes, and it's crazy, different way of living. So the four patriarchs of Genesis, we have Abraham, and he is covered from Genesis 12 to chapter 25, verse 8. It's all about Abraham. And so Abram means father. Abraham means father of many. Then Isaac is the promised son, and his life is Genesis 21 through 35. Jacob is found in Genesis 25 through 50, and Joseph is found in Genesis 30 through 50. So there's overlap in there. What's really interesting is you read through the book of Genesis, Isaac is the promised child, but of all the patriarchs, he's covered the least. There's little said about him. He's born, he has sons, and they move on. Jacob is the one who actually later becomes Israel. Everybody remember the story? He wrestles with God, and God changes his name to Israel. And what does Israel mean? Huh? I think it's Prince of God. Prince of God. Jacob was a supplanter. He was a ornery guy. But then he wrestled with God. And then Joseph was Jacob's favorite son. Okay, you remember the story? Jacob went and worked for Laban, his uncle, and he loved Leah, and he made a deal with Laban that he would work for 14 years, right? And then Rachel would become his wife. And so he worked 14 years, and Genesis says the time passed very quickly because he was so in love. And he got married, and evidently he drank too much because he woke up the next morning and it was Leah. Leah. And it's like, oh. And so he goes to Laban and says, what did you do to me? And he says, well, in our custom, the younger daughter doesn't get married before the older daughter, so you had to marry my older daughter. So he made a deal with him that he'd work another 14 years for Rachel, and he did. And so he ended up working for 28 years for this guy, but during that time he grew wealthy, right? And so then he ultimately leaves Laban and starts heading home, only to run into his brother Esau, from whom he stole the birthright, right? Everybody remember? Okay. And he thought Esau was going to be upset with him, but Esau was actually very gracious toward him. And, so there you go. So the Joseph narrative then, let's just run into that. Joseph has a dream, has actually two dreams. And those dreams spoke about his future. And he told his family about those dreams. In one of those dreams, there were 11 sheaves that all bowed down to his sheaf. And then there was another one where the sun and the moon, which represented his parents, were bowing down to him. And, that's really not a great dream to go tell your relatives. And then on top of that, he was his dad's favorite, and his dad made him a coat of many colors, and he was showing off all the time. And so one day his brothers were out keeping the sheep, and his dad says, hey, Joseph, why don't you take your brother some lunch? And so they took him to lunch, and they saw him coming from a distance and says, here comes that dreamer, let's get rid of him. So what did they do? They threw him in a well, and they were going to kill him, but their older brother interceded for him, and they ended up not killing him, but they ended up selling him as a slave to a nomadic caravan that came through that was going to Egypt. They took his coat of many colors, they put blood on it, and took it back to Jacob and said, your son was killed. Look, here's his coat, and there's blood all over it. So he was mourning, But meanwhile, remember that sermon from last year? Meanwhile, there's a meanwhile, right? Meanwhile, Joseph was being sold into slavery. So he ends up in Potiphar's house, and he ends up in prison, right? But there's always a meanwhile, and the Lord was with him. Wherever he was at, the Bible says, and the Lord was with him, right? So wherever we are, the Lord is with us, right? Regardless of our circumstance, the Lord is with us. God doesn't check out when things get tough. Okay? He's sold into slavery. He prospers in Egypt. His brothers then, he's elevated because of his dreams. He has further dreams. He's elevated to be the second in charge in all of Egypt. Everybody remember? And the Pharaoh has dreams, and he interprets the dreams, and based on the interpretation of those dreams, he's put in charge of everything in Egypt. And there were 7 years of plenty, and they stored everything, and then there were 7 years of great famine. But because they were storing and were prepared, God had shown Joseph what to do. There was prosperity, the people were being fed, and people from other lands were coming to Egypt to gather food to be fed. And Joseph's brothers came over, right? And Joseph recognized them. They didn't recognize him, but he recognized them. And through a few back and forth between them, he ends up revealing himself to them. And I believe the Apostle Paul gets Romans 8:28 from the story of Joseph. And we know that God causes all things to work together for good to those who love him, to those who are the called according to his purpose. I believe you can go right back to Joseph's life and see that that's the place from which that inspiration comes. So the Hebrews moved to Egypt under Joseph's care. And so the theme of the Joseph's narrative is this: but God sent me ahead of you to preserve you, a remnant on earth, and to save your lives by a great deliverance. You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good, to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives. So our circumstances may look bleak, but the Lord, He is in it, and He is involved in it. And that's where faith comes in. That's where trust comes in. To know that even though it might not be like I want it to be, God can still bring glory out of it. And God is still working His plan in our lives as we yield to Him. Right? So, I mean, put yourself in Joseph's place. He was in prison, and it wasn't fun. But his attitude determined his altitude. Right? His attitude determined his altitude. And so he was able to fulfill God's plan for his life because he recognized that wherever he was at, the Lord was with him. Right? Okay. All right. So then let's move to the book of Exodus. And there are so many themes that are in these books, but this is a survey. And so we're going to start moving a little quicker. Now that we got out of is a feat in and of itself. The practice of the names of the books in Hebrew is to name the book after the first few words of the book. So the book Exodus in Hebrew is actually called Wa'ela Shemot, which means, now these are the names of. Because if you look in Exodus chapter 1, these are the names of the sons of Israel. Okay? So we should not assume that the title that we are reading in the Bible is what the Hebrew title is. The title Exodus comes from the Septuagint. What's the Septuagint? Septuagint. What is the Septuagint? Come on now. The Septuagint. 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 The Septuagint is the something translation of the something. It's the Greek translation of the Hebrew Old Testament.
Yeah, that's it.
The Septuagint.
You get an A.
Yeah. Okay. So the title Exodus comes from the Septuagint. Okay. What's the Septuagint? I just told you. What's the Septuagint? Of the Hebrew Old Testament. Why is the Septuagint important? Because most of the citations in the New Testament are not to the Hebrew Old Testament, but to the Septuagint. Because the Septuagint is what the early church used as their Bible. No, the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible. So they went from Hebrew to Greek. So the authorship. Who wrote the book of Exodus? Well, from evidence within the book, we know that it had to have been someone that was familiar with Egyptian culture. Okay? And I could have given you a whole bunch of reasons why, but as you read through, you'll see that there are a lot of things that have to do with Egyptian culture. And so whoever wrote it had to know that. Most conservative Bible scholars see Moses as the author of the Septuagint. Now I got me doing it. Of the book of Exodus. The date suggests that the Exodus, the actual Exodus, occurred about 1446 BC. 1446 BC. Almost 1,500 years before Jesus was born. Now think about it. Think about it. Okay. All right. So that is 7 times longer than the United States has existed. Okay. See, we turn these pages and 1,000 years goes by, 500 years goes by, and we don't take into account that's 10 generations, 20 generations of people, right? In Exodus chapter 20, verse 40, Israel is in Egypt 430 years, okay? So that means that when they went into Egypt, it was around 1876 BC. Genesis 47:9, Jacob met Pharaoh when he was 130 years old. Jacob was born about 2006 BC. Genesis 25:26, Isaac was 60 when Jacob was born. Isaac was born about 2066 BC. Genesis 21:5, Abraham was 100 when Isaac was born. Abraham was born 2166 BC. So you look at the math. From when Abraham was born until the Exodus. What is that? 1,500 years basically? I'm not good at math. Charles, you good at math? 1466 minus 2166. 700 years? 680 years? Okay. 600, yeah, 1,500. I tell everybody when I went to seminary, all they did was teach me how to count the offering. That's so you see, from time Abraham was born until they got out, almost 700 years. Okay? Again, that's 3 times longer than the United States has existed. All right? So, a lot of time has gone from Genesis chapter 12 to Exodus chapter 1, 700 years. The scope of the book, Exodus, includes 430 years of history between Jacob's arrival in Egypt to the building of the tabernacle in the wilderness of Sinai. About 360 years lapsed between the death of Joseph and the building of the tabernacle. So Joseph dies in Egypt, but he tells everyone, take my bones with you. Right? Do you remember that? And even in the book of Hebrews, it says that by faith, Joseph said, take my bones with you. Okay, when you leave, take my bones with you. So someone had to hang on to Joseph's bones for 360 years. Chapters 30 through 40 concern 2 of those 360 years. So most of the book is about 2 years. But in total, 3 through 40.
Why did he want him to hold on to his bones?
He didn't want to be buried in Egypt. Yeah.
Did he live under the will? Saying,
I don't know how he did it. He just told them. Yeah. Put my bones, take my bones. Take my bones wherever you go. Yeah, he wanted to be part of the promised land. It was the promise, right? It was the promise that God had made them, right? What were they basing their knowledge that they were going to be leaving Egypt from? What was that based on? The promise that God had made to Abraham, that they were going to get a land. And we read in Genesis chapter 12, God even foretold them that they were going to be slaves for 400 years. The Israelites lived in Egypt 430 years. Exodus chapter 12, verse 40. 430 years. Again, twice as long as the United States has existed. Okay? Just think about time. Okay? That's almost 5 generations. How many of you can go back 5 generations and name your great, 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 great grandfather? Okay? All right? So, we're talking about people who came to Egypt, that the people who are leaving Egypt don't have no clue who they were. All they know is we grew up here. We grew up slaves. Right? So the purpose and the importance. To celebrate God's deliverance of Israel from Egyptian slavery to the freedom of a covenant relationship with Him. To celebrate God's deliverance of Israel to the freedom of a covenant relationship with Him. Now we look at the law today and we say, how can that be freedom? Right? But what we need to understand is God never intended the law to be that which justifies. It has always been faith. It has always been faith. The Old Testament books refer to Exodus more than any other Old Testament book. So in the Old Testament, within the Old Testament writers point to the book of Exodus more than any other. And in the New Testament, only Psalms and Isaiah are pointed to more than the book of Exodus. Okay, so the book of Exodus is very important in Hebrew history. Okay, and it becomes a picture, if you will, for us today of the picture of being set free from the slavery of sin into the freedom of a covenant relationship with God. So outlining. I thought one of the things that I might want you guys to do, just kind of as an assignment, and to do it with a small book, would be to look at maybe like 1 John and create an outline of 1 John. Okay? Now, many of your translations already have kind of an outline going, but try to ignore that. Okay? Try to ignore it, or find a Bible that doesn't have it outlined and read through the book in its entirety without stopping 2 or 3 times and see if you can create an outline. Okay? Just to do it. Okay? Or if you don't want to, maybe try 2 John or 3 John. Just try it. Okay? One of the things that I would like for all of us to begin to do is some of these shorter books, read the whole thing through. Read it through in one sitting versus piecemeal. Because if we read it through in one sitting, we're more likely to be able to get the flow of everything that's being said versus, just a few verses or a few chapters here and there, okay? Now, as you know, if you've been around, you know that I'm more interested in quality than quantity. So don't come and tell me you read 5 chapters. Tell me you read 4 verses and can tell me what you understood what it said versus I read 5 chapters and can't tell you anything that it said. How many of you have ever been reading the Bible and you finally recognize, I don't know what I'm reading? Because you're not paying attention, right? I mean, not because it's that hard, because I'm not paying attention. I'm just putting in time, right? So just work on that, just on your own. Pick a small book, doesn't matter which one it is, and just read through it once, read through it twice, read through it 3 or 4 times, and try to get the flow of it and then create an outline of it. So the outline, there are 2 major parts. The first part is the liberation of Israel, chapter 1 through chapter 15. Now, in chapters 1 through 4, God is preparing Israel, and he's preparing Moses. Now, Moses, okay, he was 40 years old, right? He was 40 years old when he left Israel the first time. Why did he leave? He was running for his life, okay? So he goes out, and he's in the wilderness, and he's out there for 40 years. Tending the sheep. So all this time, God is preparing him for what God is going to call him to do when he's 80 years old. When you're 80 years old, you're not put on the shelf, right? God can use anybody at any time, all right? So God is preparing Moses. God is preparing Israel. Chapters 5 through 11, God demonstrates his sovereignty. These are the plagues that God brings on Israel. Okay? Now, before we jump ahead, let's move. I want to look at Exodus chapter 3.
And is that what you would want? If you said, okay, this
Yeah.
outline of, you would put during this, here and here, this happened, during here and here, this happened?
Well, this is,
A little synopsis?
yeah, but in like one of the epistles, it wouldn't be this way because this is more history, okay? But, you might be talking about a situation or something like that. Yeah. Just there should be a flow.
Okay.
Yeah. So Genesis chapter 3, this is when God is speaking to Moses, all right? Exodus, I'm sorry, I'm still got Genesis on my brain. It says, now Moses was tending the flock of Jethro, his father-in-law, the priest of Midian, and he led the flock to a far side of the desert and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. And there the angel of the Lord appeared to him in flames of fire from within the bush. And Moses saw that the bush was on fire, it did not burn up. That though the bush was on fire, it did not burn up. So Moses thought, I will go over and see this strange sight, why the bush does not burn up. And when the Lord saw that he had gone over to look, God called to him from within the bush, Moses, Moses. And Moses said, Here I am. Do not come any closer, God said. Take off your sandals, for the place where you are standing is holy ground. And then he said, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. At this, Moses hid his face because he was afraid to look at God. And the Lord said, I have indeed seen the misery of my people in Egypt. I have heard them crying out because of their slave drivers, and I am concerned about their suffering. So I have come down to rescue them from the hand of the Egyptians and to bring them up out of the land into a good and spacious land, a land flowing with milk and honey, the home of the Canaanites, Hittites, Amorites, Perizzites, Hivites, Jebusites. And now the cry of the Israelites has risen to me, and I have seen the way the Egyptians are oppressing them. So now go, I am sending you to Pharaoh to bring the people of Israel out of Egypt. But Moses said to God, Who am I that I should go to Israel or to Pharaoh and bring the Israelites out of Egypt? And God said, I will be with you, and this will be a sign to you, that is, that I have sent you. When you have brought the people of when you have brought the people out of Egypt, you will worship God on this mountain. And Moses said to God, Suppose I go to the Israelites and say to them, The God of your fathers has sent me to you. And they ask me, What is his name? Then what shall I tell them? And God said to them, Ayah Asher Ayah. That's what he said. Okay? And we have translated that, I am who I am. Now, last year I taught on this on a Sunday morning, and the word I am is a be verb. Anybody know what be verbs are? Be verbs? Be verbs are is, are, was, were, am, been, being. Okay, those are be verbs. And this is the first person pronoun be verb. Okay, I am. All right? Now, when you say in the Hebrew, if we were to literally translate it, it would be, I is what I is. Okay? But that doesn't make sense. It's not good grammar. Yeah, that's a southern version of the Hebrew I is. And what God is saying here is, I exist. I exist. Okay? And so this is, when God speaks a word, that word never ceases to be. Does everybody understand that? Okay, when God says something, just because the sound dissipates doesn't take away the power. Okay? So God is screaming, I exist. Okay? I exist. And he's screaming it out throughout human history. I exist. He's trying to get everyone's attention. I exist. Okay? And so this is what God is saying. When they say, God, now when they tell me who sent you, what should I say? And God says, tell them I exist.
Which would actually be a better way to translate
It would be, but they didn't ask me. Yeah, tell them I exist.
Right.
Yeah, tell them I exist.
More literal.
Yeah. Say to the Israelites, and I also want you to notice in your translations, if you see the word Lord, and it is spelled with all capital letters, L, capital O, capital R, capital D, that is that word Ayah, which they've transliterated as Yahweh or Jehovah. Okay? If you see capital L, small o, small r, small d, that is the Hebrew word Adonai, which means Lord. Okay? So when you look at your translations, Yahweh, or Ayah, is the covenant name of God. And if you keep that in mind when you're reading and you see capital L, capital O, capital R, capital D, you can understand that God is speaking the covenant God. Okay? If you see small or big G, small o, small d, that's Elohim, which is basically God. That's what it means. But a lot of times you'll see Lord God, okay? And it'll be capital L, capital O, capital R, capital D. That's Yahweh God. Okay? So God demonstrates his sovereignty. God reveals himself to Moses in chapter 3. Okay? God redeems Israel, chapter 12 and chapter 13. And God completes Israel's liberation, chapter 13 through chapter 15, verse 21. Okay? Everybody good? Next, we move to Israel's adoption. Okay, they actually cross the Red Sea, and there's great debate on whether they were crossing in knee-deep water or was it actually the sea. Okay, some people say that you should translate Red Sea as like the Yom Surf or something like that, and basically they're saying that it is, you know, the shallow area where there's some reeds growing and stuff. But the Hebrew in the crossing of the Red Sea is really picturesque in that there were walls of water on both sides. Walls of water. Okay, God sent a great wind that blew. It parted the water. There were walls of water standing on both sides. The ground was dry. That's a miracle in and of itself. I mean, you know, the ground dried up and they were able to walk across on dry ground. I mean, if I was a kid, I would have been walking with my finger like this in the water, right? Because that's what it was. There were walls of water. It would be like going through an aquarium, all right? You'd be able to see the fish on either side, right? But it would be the literal water that you would be walking. And so, you know, those who say that it was only knee-deep water, the next response from the conservative side would be, well, then the great miracle is that Pharaoh and all of his armies and all their horses drowned in knee-deep water.
Right. And what about the dry land?
So, anyway. So Israel's adoption then, God's preparatory instructions, chapter 15 through 18, the establishment of the Mosaic covenant, chapter 19 through 24. This is the giving of the Ten Commandments is in Exodus chapter 20, if you want to look there. Mark it in your Bibles. Exodus chapter 20 is the 10 suggestions. Well, you'd think that's the way people treat them. I preached a series of sermons called Alternative Lifestyles several years ago, and it was about the Ten Commandments, because living the Ten Commandments these days is an alternative lifestyle. And so as I was preaching on the fourth commandment, what is the fourth commandment? Sabbath day. Okay. Sabbath day. So I was preaching on remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. And I told Nathan, when I start preaching, call me on my cell phone. And so I'm starting to preach. And so he calls me, and of course he hung up, but nobody knew what was going on. My cell phone starts ringing. I'm preaching. And so I reached down and grabbed my cell phone. I said, oh, I'm sorry, I've got to take this call. Hang on a second. So I get on the phone, and I'm acting like it's one of my students, and we're talking about an assignment. And everybody's looking at me like, I can't believe you're doing this. You know, how dare you talk on yourself? Well, you're playing games while I'm preaching.
Oh, bingo.
Nice.
That's good.
watching the Rockets while I'm preaching.
Jeremiah.
And so anyway, I carried on the conversation. Remember, Vicki, you were here. I carried on the conversation for a while, and I hung up. And I said, what's wrong with this? I said, these things keep us going all the time. We never get away from them. And God said, remember the Sabbath, keep it holy. We need to turn them off. Turn them off. And I really got under conviction because, you know, I would work from the time I got up till the time I went to bed, and I would go home on Sunday after church and work on school stuff. And the Lord convicted me about it. And so from that day, I no longer work on anything on Sunday other than come here, you know, which it's work. This is work for me. But I don't do any schoolwork. I don't get on the phone with students. I don't do any of that kind of thing. And what I found was that if you will honor God the way God says to honor Him, okay, by giving Him the Sabbath day, I was able to get more done during the 6 days than when I was not giving Him the total Sabbath. It's like giving, right? If I don't give God what belongs to Him, then what I have is cursed. It doesn't go as far. But when I honor God with what He says is His, God makes the rest go the rest. He redeems it. Okay? That's what God does. God's a redeeming God.
Yay.
Thank you both. Appreciate that. Then we have directions concerning God's dwelling among Israel and the breaking and the renewing of the covenant, chapter 32 through 34, and then the construction and dedication of objects of Israel's worship. The dedication of the temple, the dedication of all of the instruments, the table of showbread, the tabernacle, all those things, the laver. So Israel in Egypt, Exodus chapter 1 verse 7 gives the name of all the sons of Israel that came to Egypt. Verse 8, then a new king rose who didn't know Joseph, and he came to power, and that is the one that they believe his name was. Fear was rooted in the Hyksos, and I don't even remember what that was about, and Israel was enslaved. But basically, hundreds of years passed, right? And Israel was no longer regarded, the people of Israel were no longer regarded as an asset. They were regarded as a liability in Egypt. And so they began to enslave them again, all right? And then there was also the genocide taking place. They were killing them. Moses was born, Exodus chapter 2. He flees to Midian. The burning bush experience, Exodus chapter 3. And then Moses responds, what happens if they don't believe who I am, that you sent me? Send someone else to do it. Send someone else. I've been thinking about we all need to exercise our faith and be involved in teaching others. We really do. We rob ourselves of great blessing when we do not engage in helping to teach other people about Jesus, okay? Be it children, be it adults, be it youth. And I know life is busy, and we've all got a lot going on. But what is the most important thing that I can do as a believer? Help somebody else know Jesus, right? That's the most important thing I can do. And so giving myself to that end in whatever that might look like, okay? Whether it is working with youth, with adults, with children, whatever it might look like, and expressing that is going to bring benefit to my own life. As I said yesterday, I learned more by being a teacher than I ever learned by being a student. Yeah. Why? Because you got to study. You've got to study.
Got to pay attention to what you're reading.
Yeah, supposed to. So, get involved.
Yeah.
You know, find a place. You know, fill a need. If you see the need, you heard the call.
There you go.
If you don't see the need, come talk to me. I mean, Charles and Daisy are going to Europe for 2 weeks. We can't find anybody to fill their place for 2 weeks. Come on.
That's the first I've heard of.
Okay, Charles and Daisy. Okay, there we go. Okay, so we got help. We got help. All right.
I will not do it alone, but I will.
No. There we go.
But this is honestly the
Yeah,
first I've heard.
yeah. Okay.
Hands over with me. Okay, so can I bring duct tape?
Well, let's talk about that later. That's on your nickel. This is my nickel here. So what are the lessons we learned through the book of Exodus? Number one, that God prepares us for that to which He calls us. God prepares us for that to which He calls us. And, God prepared Moses, okay? He prepared Moses for 40 years while he was growing up in Egypt. He prepared him for 40 years while he was out in the desert with the sheep to go back and lead the people out, all right? In my own life, I can testify that God prepared me for today, all right? He prepared all of us for where He takes us. And the thing about it is I remember so clearly when I first got saved, I thought to myself, I can't wait till I've been saved for 20 years because I'll know more than I know now, right? And now I've been saved for 40 years and I don't know a thing. No, that's not true. I do know. I'm a little wiser. I wish I knew then what I know now. Let me put it that way. But I'm more prepared now, for what God is doing than I have been before. Okay, and my life continues to change. I hope your life is changing. Don't be stagnant. Don't be stagnant in your walk with the Lord. You need to be changing, need to be growing, need to be maneuvering and going forward. Secondly, God directs events in our lives to lead us to specific places at specific times. Yeah, right here, right now. This is where I'm supposed to be, right here, right now. Okay? Now, I had to go through the wilderness to get here. Okay? Anybody else been through the wilderness, right? Okay, 40 years. But God takes us and He leads us. And the Bible says that the path of a righteous person is ordered of the Lord. The steps of a righteous person are ordered of the Lord. And even when we get out of His will, and I've strayed, God never left me. God never left me. He was always with me. He was always working on me and working in me to get me to the place He wanted me to be. Right? God is sufficient to help us to fulfill His purpose in our life. He is I am. He exists. I'm so glad that He exists, right? And He uses whatever we have in our hand. That's what He told Moses. What do you got in your hand? What, God, what am I supposed to use? He said, well, what do you got in your hand? A stick. I got a stick. Well, throw the stick on the ground. See what happens. He threw the stick on the ground. It became a snake. He picked it up. It became a stick again. All right? So, what do you got in your hand? Before I went to Bible school, I worked for a steel bar grading company. We sold catwalks for like power plants and stuff, steel bar grading catwalks. And the old man that was retiring made a statement one time. He said, "You cannot sell out of an empty wheelbarrow." In other words, if you don't have anything to sell, you can't sell, right? And that's life fills your wheelbarrow. Life fills your wheelbarrow. You learn from experience. You learn from books. You learn from doing. So all of our life experiences, all of the things we've learned as we've read books, as we've studied God's Word, they make us who we are. Okay? And so God takes all things of our life, and whatever is in our hand, whatever is in our wheelbarrow, God uses. Okay? So we should never think, well, God called me, so therefore I don't need to study. No. If God called you, you need to study more. Right? Because if our wheelbarrow is empty,
study to show yourself approved unto God, a workman that needeth not to be ashamed, rightly dividing the word.
right, study. Well, I sleep on my Bible. I learn by osmosis. No, you don't. I was teaching a Greek class. I had first-year Greek students, and the final, they had to translate any passage that I happened to choose out of 1 John. 1 John is considered baby Greek, all right? So they translated the entire book during the semester, and then for the final, I just copied a page out of the Greek New Testament, and I said, okay, translate this without using a lexicon or dictionary, right? And so one of the students handed it back in, and he didn't have anything on his paper, and he said, God only knows. So I gave it back to him, and I said, God, A, U, F. So God uses what we have in our head and in our hands. God does not demand what we don't have available. God doesn't demand what we don't have available. So God's not going to require from me the same thing that He may require from you, or vice versa. But that again doesn't give us an excuse not to work on filling our wheelbarrow. Okay? I thank the Lord for the opportunities that He has given me educationally. I really do. Not everybody has those opportunities. I had them. Okay? But those things don't make me any better than anybody else. Okay? The one thing that I found real quick after earning my doctoral degree was I was still a sinner that needed God's grace. Right? That didn't elevate me in the kingdom one bit. Right? Now, what God requires of me because of what He's given me may be different than what He requires of somebody else. Okay? But that's okay. What we're doing here, is the result of what I've done in the past. Okay? If I had not done that, I could not do this. And so what I'm saying is, God uses what we have, but yet God's not going to require us to do something that we don't have the ability to do. Okay? If God calls us to do it, He will make sure we have the ability to do it. Okay? And so we can't be a Moses and use excuses. Okay? Moses was trying to get out of it. Well, God, I'm a stutterer, right? And God says, okay, we'll take Aaron with you, and Aaron can speak for you.
Nice try, buddy.
Yeah, nice try. If God's calling you to do something, He's going to give you the ability to do what He calls you to do, right? And so it's called faith. We never realize our full potential until we give our potential to God. We never realize our full potential until we give our potential to God. God maximizes our potential. God maximizes our potential. And so Exodus then there's a lot of information through there. You can browse through there. It talks about all of the different articles that God has as far as the priestly garments and all that they're wearing, the tabernacle, and all of it is a type, if you will, of what is in heaven. Okay? So the book of Hebrews teaches us that Moses was given the pattern for what is literally in heaven. Okay? And it was meant to be the means by which we enter into God's presence. So, in God's selective history, He is showing us how do we enter into His presence. If we were to go to visit the Queen of England, there would be, what is the word I'm looking for? Protocol that would be given to us that we would have to follow just to enter into the Queen's presence, right? The same thing is true of entering into God's presence. There is a protocol, okay? And so one of the things that the book of Exodus does in establishing the tabernacle is to establish part of that protocol. And when we move into Leviticus, Leviticus lays it out for us that there are two things that are required in worship, okay? Holiness and sacrifice. Holiness and sacrifice. The word holy is used more times in the book of Leviticus than any other book in the Bible. Holiness and sacrifice. And so this is the way that you enter into God's presence. Okay? And we can lose all of that by just getting bogged down in the history. You know, the miracles are great, the plagues are great, all of that stuff is really great. It makes great movies. Okay, Cecil B. DeMille and the Moses movie. How many of you have seen the Ten Commandments, right? I mean, it's an epic, right? And those are great movies that were made about actual events that took place, okay? But what we need to understand is that God is revealing Himself to us in this history, okay? It's a revelation of God to humanity through history. And so as we're reading it, we need to listen and look for those identifiers. Now, in Old Testament history, there are two major covenants. You've got the Abrahamic covenant, and then you've got the Davidic covenant. Okay? Because God establishes a covenant with David that his offspring would sit on the throne for all of eternity. Right? And who's that? Jesus. Jesus. Man, ain't God great? Ain't God great? All right. I think that's it for tonight. That's it for